We're going to jump into the second R, which is regulate, and I want to bridge the space between the first R and the second R in saying this. I want you to go back to what we talked about under the first R of recognize and that great scripture in Philippians when we talked around that language of settle you down. And this R is about the work of settling down. It's about getting, as I mentioned, from stress to settle, from chaos to calm. And how do we do that? We're going to walk through some concrete, practical ways that we help kids build in this space. To set this up, I want you to think back to a day that made the news not long ago when the most flights were canceled in our country on any one day. It was all over the news, and I happened to be flying from Nashville to Orlando that day. I remember pulling into the parking lot, and I got a notice on my phone that I had a delay. And I travel a lot, so I don't think that much about delays. I went through airport security, and I got a second notice of a delay. And then as I was heading to my gate, I got notification about a cancellation. And I started to feel those signs and signals inside my body of just, oh my goodness, I've got to get to Orlando. I have to speak tonight. How is this going to happen? And I looked up on the board to see if there were any other flights going to Orlando that maybe I could catch in time. And it was like something out of a futuristic movie. Like as I was looking at the board, every flight was changing. It was like delay, 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 cancel, cancel, cancel. And I could feel a lot of signs and signals in my body at that point. And so as I was brainstorming through what to do next, I could feel the volume rising in the airport. I could feel the temperature changing. And over the next hour of being in the airport, trying to figure out how to get from point A to point B, I watched 3 adult men, professionally dressed men, get handcuffed by airport security and carried off for yelling at a gate agent. Adult men who didn't have any more skills in place to get from stress to settle, from chaos to calm, that the only thing they knew to do was become so dysregulated that they'd end up getting handcuffed and carried off. And the saddest part about it all is every time I watched it happen, there were kids watching it happen. There were kids all over the airport that day, and they were watching these grown-ups as they're always watching the grown-ups. Now, that may sound like kind of an extreme example. Let me bring it a little closer to home. 2 weeks ago, I was traveling in a coffee shop out of town, and I watched the barista hand over a coffee order to a woman. Heading toward the door, she took a first sip and realized the order was wrong, and she turned around and began screaming at the barista over a wrong coffee order. And again, there were kids watching. And I'll bring it even closer to home. Not long ago, I was walking a little 7-year-old boy down our hallway toward our front lobby, and I could hear yelling in our front office. And as I rounded the corner, I saw a mom screaming at our office manager because she didn't get an after-school appointment she thought she deserved, and our waiting room was full of kids. You all, kids are sitting front row over and over, and they need to see the grown-ups in this world doing the work of regulation. And it's why we talked on the front side about how we can't take kids anywhere we haven't gone ourselves. We talked about how kids learn more from observation than information. So as we talk around this second R, I want to challenge you to be thinking about, how am I doing in this area? Because we can get over-focused on helping our kids learn to regulate and forget sometimes the best thing we have to offer them is the opportunity for them to watch regulation on us. So, how does this journey start? It starts moving from co-regulation to self-regulation. In fact, we always want to be on the journey from co-regulation to self-regulation. And I want you to think about it a little bit like this. I want you to think about it like teaching a kid you love to ride a bike. So, all of us know that we begin that process with something easy, like a tricycle. And we're gonna let kids develop some mastery around just that much. And then we're gonna move toward a bike with training wheels. And then we're gonna take the training wheels off. And when we take the training wheels off, we know that it's hard for kids to get down that wobbly motion of holding the handlebars and pedaling at the same time. So we're probably going to be holding the handlebars in the beginning, that's co-regulation, as they're learning the balance and the pedaling. And then eventually we'll take our hands off the handlebars and we'll have our hand on their back as they're getting that motion. That's co-regulation. And then eventually we're gonna be standing back in the cul-de-sac, cheering them on while they're riding successfully. In fact, eventually we're gonna be inside the house, returning emails, cooking dinner, and they'll be riding safely in the neighborhood. That's how I want you to think about this journey. Helping kids in the beginning so that they can do this independently on their own in the end. Now, what I wanna say to you is a couple of things about that. One is that if we were to stay with that analogy a little bit longer, every one of us knows that there are some kids who take to the skill development of bike riding with a lot of grit, a lot of resilience. I had one of those kids. He fell off his bike more times than I could possibly count, and every time he did, he was motivated and excited to get back on. I remember one day he had scuffed both elbows and both knees, and he would just wipe that blood off on his t-shirt or pants, although his mother preferred he didn't do that, and he would get back on and be excited and motivated to try again. There are also those kids that fall off the first time, throw the bike in a ditch and say, "You bought me a terrible bike at Target and I'm never riding that thing again." And everything in between. In fact, we're gonna talk about those kids who throw the bike in the ditch in a few minutes and which kids I think are a little more vulnerable to doing that. But if we think about that analogy a little bit longer, what we know is that all of this is skill development. Regulation is a learned skill. It's skill development. And for some kids, we're gonna have to labor longer, practice harder, and they may resist more. But we wanna stay the course in that journey, moving them towards self-regulation. We also wanna think about, as we are both teaching this and practicing this ourselves, that we wanna always be regulating first and talking second. Research would tell us that the two biggest mistakes that parents make in discipline are too much talk and too much emotion. Now think on that for a minute. Too much talk and too much emotion are reversing the equation I just talked about. We're talking first, and we should be focused on regulating first. So we always want to be moving in that direction. In fact, I would even add to that that when we get to discipline, let's say in a dysregulated moment, kids make a choice that earns them some kind of discipline. We don't want to touch the discipline until we've gotten to the regulation first, because we want to get their thinking brain online so they can make good connections. Because discipline is first about teaching. It's not about punishment. And in order for kids to absorb the teaching, to make the connections, they've got to be in a regulated state. In order for us to give good, healthy, helpful discipline, we've got to be in a regulated state. So regulate first, talk second. And the last idea I want to throw your way is this. So if we don't move in this direction, what we set the stage for is something that I call anchoring, or I sometimes refer to it as emotional tug of war. And anchoring is connected to that age-old famous phrase of misery loves company. It's kind of like when any of us feel yucky on the inside, we kind of like to tie a rope around somebody else's waist and drag them to the bottom of the lake with us. We want them to feel that same yucky, that same misery. And kids who stay stuck in co-regulation get really good at anchoring. And they set the stage again for emotional tug of war, where we're going back and forth and back and forth. And unfortunately, that ends up often being two dysregulated people trying to move toward regulation, which is a really hard equation to work with. And years ago, I was working with a great set of parents, and they had a 15-year-old son who was pretty committed to staying in co-regulation. And this mom jokingly said to me one day in my office, she said, "David, I don't want to seem dramatic, but it's even worse than emotional tug of war. Like, I sometimes feel like I'm in the middle of a hostage crisis with this kid." And I remember her saying that, and I said to her, "Well, to stay with that language for a few minutes, what is the United States position on terrorism?" And she laughed and said, We do not negotiate with terrorists. And I said, exactly. And I don't know that it's that helpful to negotiate with teenagers in dysregulated moments either. So what would it look like to interrupt that emotional tug of war, or to this mom's reporting that hostage crisis, in ways of moving toward the work of regulation? And as I say the work of regulation, I very much want you to hear me say it is work. Regulation is effortful. It involves effort and it involves practice. So we're gonna have to practice in this direction over and over, no different than back to our analogy about bike riding. We're gonna have to stay at that practice. That's not something that kids get down in 6 minutes, 6 days, or even 6 weeks. And think on that analogy one more minute to say this: every one of us knows what it's like if I haven't been on a bike for a long period of time, and even though I know how to ride a bike, I've forgotten how to ride a bike. So we've got to practice these things with consistency, or we start to lose some of those skills. So how do we do that? We do that through 3 steps that I love teaching kids and families, and the steps are what I call hand model, space, and a top 5 list. We start with a hand model because we want to make sure that kids and adolescents have a really good understanding of what happens in the brain and body when big emotions come into the equation. So we teach it to younger kids in a really simple, easy way. In fact, with young kids, I will invite parents to give everybody in the family a sheet of paper and have everybody trace their hand on that sheet of paper. And then we're going to draw a line through the middle of the hand. So we're going to separate it into 2 parts. And you could even have kids color the top and the bottom part 2 different colors. And then we're gonna label that top part. Even with kids who can't write, we'll label it for them. We're gonna call that the upstairs brain and the downstairs brain, or the thinking brain and the emotional brain. And you all, this is a brilliant idea that was introduced by Dr. Dan Siegel and Dr. Tina Payne Bryson, who wrote a wonderful book I love called The Whole Brain Child. And Dan and Tina introduced this great way of understanding the brain through the hand model. And so what's happening, to use Dan and Tina's language, is that when our thinking brain and our emotional brain are working together, we're in what's called a regulated state, and our brains look like this. But when big emotions come into the equation, we, to use their language, flip our lid. And we have to figure out, how do I get from this state back to this state? And as easy as that sounds and looks, that takes some work. And again, it takes some practice. So sometimes with little kids, I'll teach it this way. I'll say, hey, have you ever flown on an airplane? And if kids have, I'll say, how many pilots do you remember there being? And kids always know. They're like, there were 2. Why do you think there were 2? And often kids will say things like, well, I remember when I was getting off the plane, I saw all those buttons and switches, and it's too many buttons for one person. And I'm like, exactly. Our brains are like that. We need 2 pilots flying the plane. There's too much of an operating system for just one person. So we got to get our thinking brain pilot and our emotional brain pilot working together. And that's what this looks like. Now, with teenagers, I might go a little bit farther. I might say to them, hey, these are your frontal lobes right here. This is your amygdala, that fight, flight, or freeze part. And we got to get your amygdala tucked in underneath the prefrontal cortex or the frontal lobe, so that you've got everything on board you need to work through some hard situations. I have a funny mom of a teenage girl who, anytime they end up in a heated exchange, the mom will use this as a visual cue, which I think is a great idea to do after we teach the hand model of the brain. And she will look at her teenage daughter and say, look what's happening right now. Your amygdala is hanging out right here. Let's get that tucked in, and then you and I can talk. And that's a great, funny way to think about how we might use this visual cue for the kids we love, for the teenagers we love, or even that same mom would say for herself. She said, David, sometimes I'll end up yelling at my kids and I'll turn it on myself and say, why am I talking right now? Like I need to be doing the work of regulation. So that's where we start, in kind of teaching an understanding of the way it works with our brain and body when big emotions come into the equation. And then we want to move toward finding a space to do that work and coming up with a top 5 list. And I'm actually going to jump over to the top 5 list first, and then we'll come back to this idea of the space. So every kid, every adolescent who leaves our office is going to have a top 5 list at least of good, healthy coping strategies. You remember me defining this second R as employing calming and coping strategies when the nervous system goes into this heightened state of arousal. Again, getting from stress to settled. So what are my top 5 ways of getting from stress to settled? And we have 3 rules of thumb we talk a lot with families about. Rule number 1 is no screens. Now here's the thing, I'm fine with kids and adolescents having screen time for entertainment purposes with good healthy limits, but not for the purpose of coping and calming. In fact, I talk a lot with adolescents about how screens are really for numbing and not for navigating, and we're focusing on navigating emotions right now. So, no screens. Second rule of thumb is mostly movement. And research has long told us that the 2 most efficient and effective ways for any of us to get from here to here, doing the work of regulation, is through breathing and movement. And I'm all about the fastest, quickest, most efficient, effective ways for us to accomplish this. So I challenge kids to think about what are the movement-based experiences you already like to do. So I'll have kids say, I love to shoot hoops. Great. I love to ride a bike. I like to jump on the trampoline. Sometimes if I'm inside in the house and the weather's not great, I'll run up and down the stairs. I have a pull-up bar hanging from my closet, and I like to attempt pull-ups or even just hang. Whatever allows for some kind of release. Because here's the thing I want to say about movement. Research tells us that boys tend to have more physicality to their emotions. So it's why it's common in a preschool environment that preschool-age boys are more likely to yell, hit, kick, scream, throw. It's that need for a release. It's why teenage boys are a little more vulnerable to punching holes in drywall, that need for a release. And what I want you to hear me say very clearly is that need for the release is not bad. In fact, that's the way God hardwired us. We're physical, active, moving creatures. We just want to figure out how can I take that intensity, that need for a release, to something constructive. Now, what I choose to do may be good or bad, but that need for release is not a bad thing. It's just part of how I'm hardwired. And that's why movement accomplishes so much. So it's going to effectively, efficiently help me get to that regulated state. And then breathing is going to do the same. In fact, research would tell us at least 20 seconds of deep breathing will begin to reset the amygdala. So it's going to get us out of that fight, flight, or freeze mode. If we double that to 40 seconds, twice the benefit. If we triple it to 60 seconds, just 1 minute of deep breathing, it's amazing what we can accomplish. And when I'm teaching that in my office with boys, I want to recommend 2 things to you. So I wear the Apple Watch and I have my heart rate on the front screen. And I will often say to boys or adolescent males before I teach them deep breathing, hey, do you think my heart rate is going to go up or go down when you and I do a minute of deep breathing? And they always know it's going to go down. But it's not just an idea. I will show them. I'll say, look at my heart rate right now, and then we're going to look again after we do this. And they get to see all this evidence of God made us in this way that something as simple as a minute of deep breathing could begin to slow my heart rate down, could begin that process of getting from here to here, that stress to settled state, and that we can do breathing anywhere. I love teaching it to kids and having them report back to me where they've been test driving. And I had a kid tell me he was doing some square breathing on his leg under his desk right before a time test. I had another 4th grade boy tell me that he did it on the free throw line right before the ref was about to throw him the ball to make a shot in the 4th quarter of the game. He's like, David, nobody even knew that I was doing it, but I could feel that calming down start to happen before I made my shot. I love hearing kids report those kind of things. They can see all the evidence of where it starts to work. And even as I throw that idea out there, what I would say to you is that we're going to start with this top 5 list for things to do at home. And we're going to even hang up a copy of this list because when I'm in this state, needing to get to this state, I can't always even remember my good ideas that I brainstormed at a calmer moment earlier. And so I'm going to have a visual cue that helps me go back to that. Then I'm going to maybe even figure out what are some things that I could do on my list when I'm in the dugout at a baseball game and we're losing and I can feel all kinds of big emotions rising up inside of me and I'm getting to this state right here. How can I take that into my taking the ACT or the SAT when I'm a junior and I know a lot's on the line? So all the different ways that kids can start to take these ideas out into the world. That's what it's about. But when we're teaching it first at home, I also love introducing a space. And I love it for two reasons. And reason number one is this. Those of you listening who have kids 12 and under, your kids, in terms of their cognitive development, are in what we call concrete thinking. So the world is very black and white. Anytime we can create concrete experiences, kids make better connections. So if I'm in an argument with my sister or with my mom, and I learn to leave that argument to go to a space to get from here to here, that's a concrete experience. And what happens when we don't create a space is that kids learn to use a person for regulation rather than going to a place for regulation. And do you see how in keeping that is with everything we've talked about in the journey from co-regulation to self-regulation? If I'm using a person, I'm just staying stuck in co-regulation. If I'm going to a place, I'm practicing in the direction of self-regulation. Now, in the beginning, we're going to want to go with kids to this space. See it again like practicing riding a bike. We're going to be right beside them as they're learning these new skills and they're practicing these new skills. In fact, I want you to really involve kids when you brainstorm this idea. Like, where should we put this space? What should we put in this space? What kind of movement-based experiences do you think make sense in the space that we've created? And I love when families will even take a photo of their space and bring it in to show me. And I am amazed at the different ideas that families come up with. I've had families who will purchase a kickstand like at a martial arts studio that kids could kick or punch as part of their release. In my space, when my kids were growing up, we even had a punching bag. We looked like we were training boxers at the Thomas household. And it was fascinating to me how often I would come home from work some days, walk through the front door, and the first sounds that I would hear were punching and grunting. Now, what do you think the next sounds I might have heard could have been? The next sounds I often heard were crying. And if I would go check in on that particular kid, after they'd had a chance to release, move through some of that intensity, get to the sadness, I'd hear stories about feeling hurt by a friend. I heard stories of tanking a test they studied really hard and thought they'd prepared for. I heard stories of not getting asked to a dance. I heard all kinds of evidence of the disappointments, the struggles that our kids and adolescents are going to face all throughout their growth and development. And I loved the idea of my kids learning over time that going to the space to release some of that was helpful in some ways. In fact, one of my proudest parenting moments in thinking through, working through this process, these 3 steps all throughout my own kids growing up, was when my firstborn went away to college. And I remember calling her first set of midterm exams. And I was like, sweetie, how are you doing? First college exams. And she said to me, Dad, I think I have clocked in close to 20 miles this week. And what she was communicating was that she had eventually figured out her place, her space was running. Eventually, kids may not need an actual space somewhere in the house or somewhere in their rooms because they figure out the movement-based outlets that help them experience this release. And she figured out I could sit right there at my desk preparing for exams, feeling full of stress and worry, or I could get up and go run 3 miles, come back, and I'm in a more settled space to do the work of learning. That's the long objective. That's the journey from co-regulation to self-regulation that we want to be training kids towards as we introduce these 3 ideas. Now, last thing I want to throw out to you as we talk around this concept of space is, I mentioned a few minutes ago with the bike riding example that there are some kids who want to throw the bike in the ditch after maybe only 1 or 2 attempts and announce that we bought a bad bike. There are going to be kids who are going to resist the space, and they're going to even resist referencing their top 5 list because they would rather use us as their resources than develop more resourcefulness. And in our experience as a practice, we talk a lot about this with my colleagues. We have discovered over the years that bright kids tend to be some of the most likely candidates to resist this work. Kids who have really strong cognitive muscles often have lesser developed emotional muscles. And so we're gonna have to labor a little longer. We're gonna have to practice more with those kids. And we're gonna have to really keep our eye on the temptation to come back into emotional tug of war, because bright kids, and we need to laugh about this, bright kids tend to be highly skilled in two ways. They are highly skilled in negotiation, and they are highly skilled in manipulation. And left to their own devices, they'll just keep getting better at those two. So, for example, the mom I mentioned a little bit earlier, who had the 15-year-old son, who mirrored a hostage crisis experience, once told me that her son had a strong tendency to follow her around the house every time he became dysregulated. And he'd get really loud and really intense. She said to me, David, not only can he not handle hearing no, he really struggles hearing maybe. So she said, for example, if my husband's traveling and he were to say, hey, can I do this on Saturday? And I were to answer to say, you know what, maybe. I need to check with Dad and see when he gets back in town. He would immediately start in with a lot of intensity. And he would say things like, why do you have to always get somebody else's opinion? Why can't you make a decision on your own? And he would follow her around the house, this loud, intense negotiation. And she said, I have attempted to go to my room to create some space, but he also doesn't just get intense, he'll violate boundaries. She said, he'll just march right into my room without permission. So we talked through introducing these 3 steps, doing a little more education with him, revisiting the concept of the space, brainstorming a top 5 list. And I said to her, I want you to, in these moments, lead with a great one-liner, something along the lines of, buddy, I love you too much to argue. We're done talking. They did all this great brainstorming and problem solving on the front side. He hit his first dysregulated moment since that brainstorming. And he must have forgotten all of what they discussed, because his mom looked at him and said, I love you too much to argue. I'm heading to my room. You go to your space. And he followed her, and she had wisely decided, because he violated boundaries, to start locking her door. So he reached for the handle, and all of a sudden it wouldn't open. Now, what would be your guess on what a 15-year-old boy might do next? Maybe some of you listening are thinking, I bet he started banging on the door. And I think a lot of adolescents would. But remember what I said about this kid on the front side. He's a really, really bright kid. He didn't bang on the door. Some of you may be thinking, I bet he started to pick the lock. And that's a good guess, but he didn't do that either. Let me tell you what this kid did instead. He started knocking in this low, incessant, obnoxious knock like nails on a chalkboard. I think he was thinking, I'll draw her out. Let's see how long she can withstand this. And the mom said to me, David, guess what I did? I said, what? And she said, I said out loud, I'm behind on podcast. I'm going to put my headphones in and play catch up right now. I was so proud of that mom. I got up off my couch and high-fived her. I thought that was fantastic. I said, what happened next? And she said, I waited a good 15 minutes, and then I took my headphones out, and there was quiet. And I thought to myself, finally, we're making some headway. He's gone to his space. We're mastering this work of regulation. She got up off her bed, and the floor creaked, and he heard that, because 15 minutes later, he was still standing outside the door. This bright kid, these strong cognitive muscles, really weak, underdeveloped emotional muscles, couldn't practice anything other than waiting her out. And listen to his last attempt. He leaned in when he heard his mom walking, and he said, what kind of mother won't listen to her own son? Now let's laugh together and acknowledge that's like an Olympic gold medal in manipulation right there. And I am thankful that very wise mom didn't get baited back in that moment, because she could have been. I think she only got that much more committed to doing the work, to traveling that journey from co-regulation to self-regulation with this bright kid who was doing a lot of resisting and knowing everything we've discussed, that it's going to take a lot of practice. And practice makes progress. Many of us grew up being told that practice makes perfect. I want you to throw that out. I don't love that statement. I don't even think it's true. I don't know about you, but there have been a lot of things in this life that I have practiced hard at. And not only did I not get perfect at it, I didn't even get all that great at it, but everything I have ever practiced, I at least got a little bit better at. Practice makes progress. And I want to share an example with you of something an amazing 10-year-old boy worked on in my office. This is his top 5 list that I think is nothing but fantastic. So I want you to look for evidence of the things we talked about in the top 5 list. A lot of movement, the breathing as well. He decided that he would practice doing a lot of running. He would squeeze some stress balls. In fact, he announced to me that he was going to keep stress balls in all the places. He kept one in his backpack. He kept one in his desk drawer at home when he was doing homework and he would get really frustrated and he needed to get his thinking brain back online. He kept one in the glove compartment of his mom's vehicle so that if he'd had a frustrating day and he was reporting in at pickup, he had access to one there. I thought it was just brilliant that he was figuring out all the different places he might need some of the tools of regulation and taking his top 5 list on the road. He also kept a journal and he would record different events that had happened in life. Again, moving toward that expression we talked about in the first R. Not suppression, not eruption, but expression. He also decided he was going to scream into a pillow rather than screaming at his sister, which he had had a tendency to do. And you all think on that idea for a minute because there's another great concrete tool. We often use pillows with young kids and we'll say, okay, it's okay to scream at a pillow. You never want to scream at a sibling. The pillow's not hurt when we scream at the pillow. It's okay to punch a pillow and the pillow's not hurt. You never punch a family member. It's okay to throw a pillow down. A pillow's not hurt. We don't ever push down a person. Do you see how we're creating these distinctions, these concrete categories where kids are learning the mechanics, the ideas, the strategies that work, the coping skills that are effective and healthy, as opposed to the things that kids are tempted to do when they need that release? And then he added on some breathing. Now, I call it combat breathing with a lot of boys I work with because I have to dress it up a bit to get them a little more bought in, where Sissy calls it square breathing in her office. And combat breathing is actually something I learned from work I did years ago with Navy SEALs and Army Rangers and their spouses. And think on these individuals. These are individuals who are in life or death situations. They have to get their thinking brain online. They have to be able to make thoughtful decisions in rational moments. And they call it combat breathing. It's a required skill they have to demonstrate. And I remember asking them, this is so fantastic. Can I please call it that with all the boys I work with? And they were like, yes, absolutely. And it's amazing as I have explained that to boys and adolescent young men over the years, how much more bought in they get when they figure out, oh yeah, Navy SEALs and Army Rangers do this. If we don't labor in this space and helping kids come up with a top 5 list of good, healthy coping skills, I want to share with you the kind of list that I think a lot of kids create on their own. And that list is mom, 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 and mom. Moms, you can become their primary resources unless we're helping them take this journey toward developing more resourcefulness. This journey from co-regulation to self-regulation. This journey of taking the emotion to something constructive. And as I think about this second R and all of these ideas that we're speaking around, I'm reminded of this passage in Matthew 5, verse 8. I love this translation in the Message. It says, you're blessed when you get your inside world, your mind and heart put right. Then you can see God in the outside world. And I think those words are so incredibly true when I think about this second R. I think all the way back to the first story I shared with you of the 3 men in the airport. I think if they could have got their mind and heart right in the frustration of those canceled flights, how different it could have been. Because to the wisdom of this scripture, not only can I see evidence of God's goodness in the world differently, I can see evidence of his image bearers differently. That I believe those men in the airport, that woman in the coffee shop, that mom in our office could have seen the people they were interacting with as image bearers of God differently. So I think doing this work of recognizing and regulating allows us to get from stress to settled in a way to where we can not just see evidence of God's goodness differently in the world, we can see evidence of God's people differently too. Even when we do this good work and all this great practice, sometimes we're still just gonna fumble the ball. And that's what sets the stage for us to practice the work of repair. And I'm excited to step into a conversation about the work of repair in our next session.